In this lecture, we are going to explore a feature called functions. Just like variables, functions are a common feature in PHP. They're heavily used in WordPress. A function is a block of code that can perform a specific task. To better understand, let's look at an example. In our file, let's clear the code inside the PHP tags. Next, let's echo a welcome message to the user. Previously, we would store a string in a variable. It's utterly acceptable to output a value rather than a variable. If you don't need to reuse a value, you may want to skip storing it in a variable. Let's shift our focus back to functions. The code we've written is not reusable. For example, let's say we want to output this message multiple times. To take it a step further, we may want to output this message in various files. Outputting the same message will require copying and pasting the same code. At first glance, that may seem fine, but it could lead to issues. What if we want to change the message? We would need to search for this line of code in various files. Each line would need to be updated. It's inconvenient and tedious. Ideally, we should be able to update this line once, and everything would reflect the update. Functions are the solution to our dilemma. Above this line of code, let's write the function keyword. Functions are defined with the function keyword. After typing this keyword, we can add a space followed by the function's name. We can call our function whatever we want. The naming rules for variables apply to functions. Let's call our function greeting. Next, let's add parentheses and curly brackets. The parentheses can contain a list of arguments. In a future lecture, we will revisit the topic of arguments. For now, we can safely ignore the parentheses. As for the curly brackets, they contain the body of the function. Inside these curly brackets, we can write additional code. Let's move the echo statement to inside the function. The purpose of a function is to outsource reusable code into a centralized location. By default, code inside functions is not executed. If we were to view the browser, the message would not get rendered on the page. Functions must be invoked after defining them. Let's give that a try. After the curly brackets, let's write the name of the function followed by a pair of parentheses. What we're doing is called calling a function. By calling a function, code written inside a function's curly brackets is executed. Let's check out the browser. The message from the function gets rendered. So far, this feature doesn't seem like anything special. What's the point of using a function? Functions are reusable. They can be called multiple times in our application. Let's try that out. Switch back to the editor. Let's try calling the greeting function a second time. By calling the greeting function twice, the code inside the function runs twice. Imagine if our function had 20 lines of code. Without functions, we would be copying and pasting the same block of code. That's not efficient. PHP introduces functions for reusing code. Whenever we want to reuse code, we can call it with a single line of code. Let's switch over to the browser. As you can see, the same message gets rendered. Overall, functions provide convenience. Our example is simple, but there aren't rules for how many lines of code can be written in a function. We can have 1 line of code or 20 lines of code. There's one more feature I want to show you. Let's head back to the editor. Earlier, we ignored the parentheses of a function definition. Now that we understand the basics of a function, let's take a moment to discuss this portion of the syntax. The parentheses store values passed onto the function. At the moment, our function will output the same message. It's not customizable. In some cases, we may want to modify a line of code in our function. For example, what if we're going to output different messages from our function? Would we need to define multiple functions? That would be inefficient. We can make our function flexible by adding parameters. Parameters are variables for functions. These variables can be configured during the function's execution. Inside the parentheses of the function, add a variable called message. Variables can be added to a function by defining them inside the parentheses. Unlike before, we don't have to initialize these variables with values. We can configure the value of a variable by updating our function calls. Inside the parentheses of the first function, we will add a different greeting. Notice how I'm not defining a variable. The value we pass into the function will be the value of the variable in the function's parameters. Let's add a different greeting to the second function call. By adding parameters, we can pass data to a function to modify its behavior. In this example, we are trying to output different messages. Let's use our variable. Inside the function, let's replace the current value with the message variable. Lastly, let's view the browser. Awesome! We've got a flexible function to output various messages. Parameters are an optional feature to pass on values to a function. There's one more thing I want to mention before moving on to the next lecture. There's another word you may hear when discussing a function's parameters, which is the word argument. The words parameter and argument can be interchangeable terms. However, there is a difference. A parameter refers to the variable defined in a function's declaration, whereas an argument refers to the value of the variable. Most developers will throw around these words interchangeably. It isn't the end of the world if your phrasing is incorrect. No one's going to scold you for doing so. As long as you understand there's a difference, you should be good to go. Let's move on from functions. In the following lecture, we'll start talking about arrays.